Most people say they want to change, yet few understand what transformation actually demands. Carl Jung believed real change is not a matter of willpower or positive thinking, but a psychological reorganization of the self. You do not simply become someone new, you confront who you already are. Transformation begins when the old identity can no longer hold your life together. What once worked starts to fail. Tension builds, confusion appears. This is not weakness. It is the psyche signaling that a deeper pattern is ready to emerge. Growth, in Jung's view, begins not with improvement, but with disintegration. Transformation rarely announces itself gently. More often it arrives as inner tension, a growing sense that opposing forces are pulling the personality in different directions. One part of the psyche clings to familiar habits, values, and identities, while another presses for change. This conflict is uncomfortable, and many people rush to eliminate it as quickly as possible. Yet psychologically, this tension is not a problem to be solved. It is a signal that the personality has reached a limit and must reorganize itself. I've observed that meaningful change never begins in comfort. It begins when the old way of living no longer fits the inner reality. What once provided stability starts to feel restrictive. Decisions that were once automatic become difficult. The individual feels divided, unsure, sometimes even exhausted by their own contradictions. This state is often mistaken for failure or weakness. In truth, it is a necessary stage of development. Without conflict, the psyche has no reason to move. Inner conflict reveals where growth is required, exposes outdated beliefs, rigid attitudes, and unconscious loyalties that no longer serve the whole personality. When these opposites are held consciously rather than suppressed, something new becomes possible. The psyche begins to search for a third position, not a compromise, but a more inclusive standpoint that can hold both sides without collapse. This is how transformation takes shape from within. Many people attempt to resolve inner conflict by choosing one side and rejecting the other. They label one impulse as correct and the other as wrong. This approach may bring temporary relief, but it halts deeper change. True transformation requires endurance. One must tolerate uncertainty without rushing to resolution. This capacity to remain with tension is a sign of psychological maturity. It allows the unconscious to contribute its wisdom rather than being silenced by premature certainty. In my work, I have seen that when individuals allow inner conflict to unfold consciously, their lives begin to shift in unexpected ways. New values emerge. Old fears lose their authority. Choices feel less forced, and the personality expands rather than hardens. What was once experienced as inner division becomes a source of strength. Transformation, then, is not the absence of conflict, but a new relationship with it. And tension is held with awareness. It becomes creative rather than destructive. And perhaps this is the essential insight. The discomfort you are trying to escape may be the very force shaping the person you are meant to become. For transformation to occur, the ego must loosen its attachment to the identity it has constructed. Most people confuse who they are with the roles they have learned to inhabit: the dependable one, the achiever, the caretaker, the thinker, the one who holds everything together. These identities provide structure and safety, but they are not the totality of the self. When life begins to demand change, the ego resists because it fears disintegration. To let go of an old identity feels like a kind of death, even when that identity has become constricting. I have often observed that transformation stalls not because people lack insight, but because they cling to an image of themselves that once served a purpose. The ego says, "This is who I am," when in fact it is who one has been. Growth requires the courage to question this certainty. The old identity may have provided meaning, approval, or survival, yet when it no longer aligns with inner reality, it becomes a prison. One continues to act out of habit while feeling increasingly hollow. Letting go does not mean erasing the past. It means releasing the need to protect an image at all costs. The ego must accept that it does not control the whole psyche. Something larger is at work, pressing toward a more complete expression of the self. This surrender is not weakness. It is an act of intelligence. The ego steps aside just enough to allow a deeper center to emerge. During this phase, confusion is common. The person may feel unrecognizable to themselves. Old motivations fade while new ones have not yet formed. This in-between state is often misinterpreted as failure or loss of direction. Yet psychologically, it is a necessary emptiness. The the psyche clears space for a new orientation. When the ego tolerates this uncertainty, transformation can proceed. Many people attempt to avoid this discomfort by reinforcing their old identity even more strongly. They become rigid, defensive, or exhausted. But true transformation cannot be forced through repetition. It requires relinquishment. When the ego finally releases its grip, something unexpected occurs. A new sense of coherence slowly takes shape, not based on who one thinks they should be, but on who they are becoming. And perhaps this is the quiet courage transformation asks of us, to allow the old self to fall away without knowing exactly who will stand in its place. One of the greatest misunderstandings about transformation is the belief that growth comes from removing what we dislike about ourselves. People often approach change as an act of purification, cutting away flaws, suppressing impulses, erasing traits that feel unacceptable. But the psyche does not become whole through elimination. It becomes whole through integration. What is rejected does not disappear. It retreats into the shadow, where it continues to influence life indirectly and often destructively. The shadow contains everything the ego has decided does not belong in its self-image. This may include anger, vulnerability, ambition, envy, dependency, or even creativity and strength that once felt unsafe to express. These qualities were often excluded for understandable reasons: adaptation, survival, or the need for approval. Yet what was once necessary can later become limiting. When these aspects remain unconscious, they express themselves through projection, self-sabotage, or rigid moral judgments. A person believes they are controlling themselves when in fact they are being controlled by what they refuse to see. Integration begins with honesty. One must be willing to recognize uncomfortable traits without immediately condemning them. This does not mean acting them out or excusing harmful behavior. It means understanding their origin, their purpose, and the energy they carry. Every shadow element contains potential. Anger holds vitality and boundary. Envy points toward unlived desire. Fear reveals where growth is being resisted. When these forces are acknowledged consciously, they lose their compulsive quality. Many people fear that confronting the shadow will make them worse, less moral or less controlled. In practice, the opposite is usually true. Awareness humanizes, it softens extremes. A person who recognizes their own darkness becomes less likely to project it onto others. Compassion grows, not as sentimentality, but as realism. One no longer needs to pretend to be better than one is. Transformation accelerates when the shadow is welcomed into consciousness. The personality gains depth and flexibility. Energy that was once spent on repression becomes available for creativity and meaningful action. Life feels fuller, more grounded, less divided. The individual no longer lives at war with themselves. This process requires patience and humility. The shadow cannot be integrated in a single moment. It reveals itself gradually as the ego becomes strong enough to tolerate complexity. But each step toward integration restores a piece of the self that was lost to fear or adaptation. And perhaps this is the essential truth of transformation. You do not become whole by becoming better. You become whole by becoming more honest. Suffering is often treated as a mistake, something to be fixed, avoided, or quickly explained away. Yet in the psychology of transformation, suffering has a different meaning. It frequently signals that the psyche is undergoing reorganization. When old structures can no longer contain inner reality, tension appears. This tension is not accidental. It is the pressure required to reshape the personality around a deeper center. I have seen many people arrive at transformation only after a period of profound discomfort. What once provided orientation begins to fail. Goals lose their appeal. Relationships feel strained. One's sense of identity weakens. This experience is often labeled depression, anxiety, or crisis. And while these terms are not incorrect, they do not capture the whole picture. Psychologically, such states often indicate that the ego is being challenged by something larger than itself. The psyche is demanding change. Suffering becomes destructive only when it is meaningless. When pain is experienced without understanding, it feels arbitrary and unbearable. But when suffering is approached as a message rather than an enemy, its nature changes. One begins to ask not, how do I get rid of this? But what is trying to emerge through this? This shift does not eliminate pain, but it transforms the relationship to it. The individual stops fighting blindly and begins listening. This listening requires patience. The ego prefers quick solutions. It wants relief, certainty, and return to normality. But transformation does not restore the old order, it replaces it. Suffering often persists precisely because the ego is attempting to return to a form of life that no longer fits. When this resistance softens, the psyche begins to reorganize itself. New values appear, new priorities take shape. The person gradually feels aligned again, though in a way that feels unfamiliar at first. It is important to understand that suffering alone does not guarantee growth. What matters is whether the experience is reflected upon and integrated. Avoidance prolongs pain. Honest engagement gives it direction. When suffering is held consciously, it becomes formative rather than destructive. The individual emerges not unscarred, but more substantial. Transformation rarely feels like improvement in the moment. It often feels like loss of certainty, identity, or control. Yet something essential is being gained beneath the surface: depth. The personality becomes less rigid, more capable of holding complexity. Life feels heavier, perhaps, but also more real. And perhaps this is the truth we resist most. Suffering is not always a sign that something has gone wrong. Sometimes it is the psyche reshaping itself for a truer life. As transformation unfolds, something subtle but decisive begins to appear. A sense that life is no longer being lived from borrowed patterns alone. I called this emergence the self, not as an ideal or a goal, but as the organizing center of the whole personality. Unlike the ego, which is shaped largely by adaptation and fear, the self represents a deeper order. It does not demand perfection, demands wholeness. Transformation moves toward this center, not away from it. Individuation is often misunderstood as self-improvement or radical independence. In truth, it is neither. It is the gradual alignment between conscious life and unconscious reality. As this alignment strengthens, inner conflict begins to reorganize rather than fragment the personality. One no longer feels torn between who they are and who they present to the world. Actions arise with greater inner agreement. Choices feel less forced, not because life becomes easier, but because the psyche is no longer divided against itself. This process changes how a person relates to others. They no longer need to imitate, compete, or constantly compare themselves. Approval loses some of its power. Rejection loses some of its threat. The individual becomes more rooted in their own experience. This rootedness is not arrogance, it is stability. One can engage with the world without losing oneself in it. Individuation also brings a different relationship to uncertainty. When life is guided solely by the ego, uncertainty feels dangerous. When life is guided by the self, uncertainty becomes tolerable. One trusts that meaning will unfold through participation rather than control. This trust does not remove struggle, but it prevents despair. The individual senses that even confusion has a place within a larger pattern. Importantly, individuation does not isolate the person from society. It deepens participation. One contributes not as a role or a mask, but as a whole human being. Creativity becomes more authentic. Responsibility feels chosen rather than imposed. Life gains a quiet coherence that cannot be fabricated through effort alone. This emergence of the self is often felt not as excitement, but as relief. One stops fighting oneself. Energy that was spent on inner conflict becomes available for living. The personality feels less brittle, more resilient. Even suffering, when it appears, feels contextualized rather than overwhelming. And perhaps this is the heart of transformation, when you live from the center of your being rather than its edges. Life no longer asks you to become someone else, it asks you to become whole. Transformation is often imagined as a single, decisive moment, a breakthrough, a revelation, a turning point after which everything is different. But psychologically, this image is misleading. True transformation does not conclude, it unfolds. The psyche is not a structure that reaches completion, but a living process that continues to reorganize itself as life changes. Each stage of life brings new demands, new conflicts, and new opportunities for integration. To believe that one can arrive at a final version of the self is to misunderstand the nature of psychological growth. I have observed that many people become discouraged because they expect transformation to deliver permanent certainty or lasting peace. When confusion returns, they assume they have failed or regressed. In reality, this return is a sign that development is continuing. What once felt resolved must be met again from a new level of consciousness. The psyche revisits familiar themes: identity, purpose, relationship, mortality, not to trap us, but to deepen our understanding of them. Transformation then requires humility. One must accept that becoming whole is not a destination, but a way of relating to oneself over time. This acceptance changes the tone of inner life. One no longer demands perfection or final answers. Instead, one remains attentive, curious, and responsive. The individual learns to recognize when old patterns are resurfacing, not with judgment, but with awareness. This awareness is itself a sign of growth. As the process continues, the personality becomes less rigid. There is more tolerance for contradiction, more patience with uncertainty. One no longer needs to defend a fixed identity at all costs. Change is no longer experienced as a threat, but as a signal that life is still active within. Even setbacks become meaningful because they are seen as part of an ongoing dialogue between conscious intention and unconscious reality. This lifelong nature of transformation also brings a quieter kind of freedom. One stops chasing an ideal self and begins engaging with the self that is present now. Energy is no longer wasted on comparison or self-condemnation. Attention turns toward participation in work, in relationship, in the unfolding of one's own inner life. Growth becomes less dramatic, but more genuine. Perhaps the most important shift is this: transformation is no longer something you do to yourself. It becomes something you cooperate with. You listen, respond, adjust. The psyche reveals what is needed, and you meet it as honestly as you can. And perhaps this is the final understanding transformation offers. You are not meant to arrive. You are meant to continue becoming, with awareness, courage, and humility.